Welcome to episode 156 of the Confidence Through Health podcast, featuring Susan Peirce Thompson. She is a New York Times bestselling author and an expert in the psychology and neuroscience of eating and food addictions. And Susan tells us her story of addiction and why it's important for her to help people with addiction, why it's important for her to help people understand that food addiction is real. She helped me clarify some of the things that I was potentially getting wrong, if you will, with people that have that addiction to food. And she helps us understand what's going on in the brain when you eat those trigger foods, sugar, flour, processed foods, what's happening for everybody, but also specifically what's happening for the food addict and how they can overcome it. Where can they get help? She created Bright Line Eating in order to help people and give them an outlet to learn how to eat properly, learn how to deal with the food addiction and eat in our environment where we have so much food that is not as nutritious as we need it to be for our bodies, but is so many of those foods are trigger foods. And so we talk about what's happening in the brain when we eat those foods, how we can overcome that, how it's more than just willpower. And we talk about what happens once your body starts eating those healthy things. What does your body want and crave? And movement is one of those things. So we talk about how our lifestyle starts to change as we do that. And so if you're somebody who is potentially looking at food and thinking that maybe have an addiction to it, there is a quiz that she gives us that you can take that will give you the opportunity to figure out if you're susceptible or not. But it's a great episode to listen and trying to figure out where do I fall on this scale of food addiction? Because I think we all might see times in our lives where we think we're addicted, or we think we can't go without certain foods, but is it truly an addiction? And Susan helps us decipher all that and figure out where we are, where we need to go, and how to get help. So thank you, Susan, for joining me on the Confidence Through Health podcast.
Thanks, Jerry. Great to be here.
So you are an expert in food addiction. And as I was telling you before, you made me stop and think about some of the things that I've told people about food addiction, because I've told them that, it's not really an addiction. You can control it. And you made me think about it in a different way because your brain is actually in control. But tell us a little bit about why you chose to go into helping people with food addiction. What was the impetus there that this is what I want to do for people?
Yeah, sure. Well, of course, because of my own food addiction, but It didn't start with food addiction. My addiction was super clear to me because I was a drug addict as a teenager. Okay. So, I started with mushrooms, which of course can be an amazing experience. And I had a phenomenal mind expanding spiritual experience when I was 14 on mushrooms. Yeah. And then our language is so unfortunate, right? The word drugs, right? I was like, oh, drugs aren't bad. They're good.
Right.
It's amazing. I'm going to do this every chance I get. And so I graduated pretty soon from mushrooms and acid and ecstasy and pot and alcohol to crystal meth. And at that point, I was 16. I was already really struggling with my weight, and the miracle of not needing to think about food anymore was just amazing to me. And I lost a lot of weight. I got down to about the size I am now. And just by the way, by the age of 11, I weighed more than I weigh now. So, wow. Struggling with a weight problem as a teenager. Yeah. Crystal meth took care of that, but it also produced a lot of unfortunate drug-induced psychosis. And I dropped out of high school, graduated to cocaine and freebasing cocaine, and then just buying crack cocaine off the streets, turned to prostitution. And by the age of 19, that was my resume. I got clean and sober when I was 20 and stayed that way. So I haven't had a drink or a drug in 28 years.
That's great.
And yeah. Thank you, God. Super grateful for that. And my addiction jumped right to food. And at that point, I could see it as addiction. I was, a few months sober, going to a midnight 12-step meeting and then going out to eat afterwards at Denny's with everyone. But then even just a big plate of food at Denny's at 2 a.m. wasn't enough for me. I had to swing by a convenience store and get 2 pints of ice cream and a box of cookies and, maybe then Taco Bell and get 4 tacos and bring it all home and eating it. Right. I was sitting there eating all this food. And at some point I had a moment of clarity and I realized this is not sober behavior. Like I'm
Right.
using this food the way I used to use drugs. It was very clear to me. And I didn't know what
So
to do about
you
it.
just transferred your addiction basically,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's called cross addiction, and it's
Yeah.
a really common thing. So addiction takes root in the nucleus accumbens, where the receptors are dopamine receptors, and they downregulate after being blown out through all this repeated use, not of regular stimuli, but of excessive stimuli, right?
Right.
Donuts aren't really food, right? They're
Right.
drugs, just like cocaine isn't just a plant. It's
Right.
taking the coca leaf and refining and purifying it and intensifying it, right?
Yeah.
And so, donuts are to food as pornography is to sex, as
Right.
cocaine is to the coca plant. It's all, it's a drug, right?
Yeah.
And so those dopamine receptors get blown out, and then they downregulate. They become less numerous, less responsive. And now you feel itchy, restless, and discontent unless you could get another hit, not to get high, but to get normal, just to come back to baseline and feel okay for a bit.
Yeah.
So, so I was aware that I was a food addict when I was 21, but it was another 7 years before I found real recovery. And, I stopped eating sugar. I stopped eating flour. I started weighing and measuring my food, because food addiction is actually the only addiction that's really it lives equally in both categories: a substance addiction, the addiction to sugar, flour, processed foods, and a process addiction, the addiction to eating, the behavior of eating itself, like gambling or shopping. Food is usually, if you look in textbooks and so forth, they'll usually classify it as a process addiction, but then you've got whole other textbooks that are literally called processed food addiction, right? And food is both a substance and a process addiction. So I need to be mindful both of the foods I eat to make sure to avoid the substances that trigger me, and also how I eat, to eat in meals, not grazing or snacking, but discrete meal times. And I weigh and measure my food. Not that I eat a tiny bit of food, I eat an abundant amount of food. But when I put it on a digital food scale, I know I've had enough, and my brain doesn't need to say, do you maybe get a bit more? How about a bit more? How about now? How about now? And I just quiet all of that chatter in my mind. So I come at food addiction from a very brain-based perspective. After I got clean and sober, I went into academia. I majored in cognitive sciences. I got a Ph.D. in brain and cognitive sciences, and I spent 18 years as a tenured psychology professor before starting Bright Line Eating. So I teach people about the brain science, the neuroscience of food addiction. And Jerry, just so you know, like the you that didn't used to believe in food addiction, I would love to show you someday the brain scans of the food addicted brain and the cocaine addicted brain, because they look identical. Like you can circle it on the brain scan. Like there's the addiction right there. There's the nucleus accumbens. There's the dearth of dopamine response, just gimpy, meager. As a matter of fact, to my eye, at least, the food addicted brain looks a tiny bit worse.
Oh, really?
It's a little bit worse. Yeah. I mean, they're probably equal, statistically speaking. But yeah, I mean, it's, food addiction is controversial out there in some circles, but I'll tell you where it's not controversial. It's not controversial among academics and scientists who study addiction in the brain. Ask anyone who studies addiction in the brain. It's like, oh yeah, food is addictive. Like we see it in the brain easily.
Yeah. So, well, kudos for you for one. Like, and I mean, that's a story that anybody listening can be like, okay, I can change from where I'm at to reach a level of success that at least society thinks is success. But to be able to find a purpose and be able to find like, okay, I have an outlet that I can help people. Right.
Yeah.
But the other piece of it, like the food addiction piece, one of the things that I used to say was that like, oh, you're not, it's you're eating the wrong types of foods. And if you switch types of foods, well, you're not really going to be addicted to that anymore. But as you said, like it's those trigger things. And so like, as far as like knowing what your triggers are, is that just a process of self-elimination, or is that like everybody has the same triggers?
Yeah. Yes. So here's what I've found. I've found that if you set people off on a journey of just seeing what their triggers are, they'll probably never recover. Yeah. There are 12-step programs that do that. Well, I'm thinking in particular of Overeaters Anonymous, where they have no shared definition of abstinence or what food plan to use to support recovery. Yeah. And people there generally stay heavy on average. There's people who found huge success in Overeaters Anonymous. I don't want to say there aren't, but on average, people stay heavy and end up in an endless cycle of experiments of giving up, sugar but not artificial sweeteners, white flour but not brown flour, and on and on and on. And so I do think a starting point of eliminating sugar, flour, artificial sweeteners is really helpful. But always around the margin, there's going to be issues where people are going to need to figure out what lights them up in particular and what doesn't. So borderline foods are going to include cheese, which has casomorphins in it. But a lot of people, especially if they weigh and measure the quantity, can eat, 2 ounces of cheese along with a healthy plate of vegetables and an apple and other things and be fine. Some people just can't. Peanut butter is another one, which, some people, their number one binge food was to sit down with a jar of peanut butter and a spoon. For other folks, like me, I can do peanut butter in moderation, I'll weigh and measure it, but I can do a little peanut butter with an apple and it's okay. So that's why I said yes. It's a yes and situation. Yeah. I do think starting with a foundation of letting go of processed foods, sugar, flour, artificial sweetener, and I mean all flour. I mean almond flour, coconut flour. It's really the purifying and refining process that does us in. Yeah.
Well, and they're treating it. They're not just grinding it up. They're treating it with stuff chemicals that we don't need in our body.
No. Right. Exactly. And so ideally try to eat foods that don't even have labels. That's not going to work across the board. My gosh, buy a bottle of soy sauce, buy a packet of tofu. Don't feel bad about it, but in general, shop in the perimeter of the grocery store and, just buy food, carrots. And like I own a company, Bright Line Eating. And to this day, and God, I hope forever, we do not sell food. We're not going to sell anybody packaged anything. Like go to the store and buy produce, buy food, Yeah.
Well, and so from the brain standpoint, right? Like you were talking about dopamine hits and like the things that light us up, that's different from your mind and like willpower. Cause I know a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to have willpower at January 1st and I'm just going to change the way I eat and everything's going to be fine. But if they don't address what's actually happening in the brain, they're going to go through withdrawals they don't necessarily understand, or they're going to hit that trigger and not know how to deal with it. Correct?
That's right. Willpower is an interesting thing, Jerry. So execution over the long term is really the issue at hand. And we can know what to eat and not eat. We can be, determined to the nth degree. And still a month or 2 or 3 later, when we pick up our plate and go through the buffet line, what's going to be important is what's just happened in our lives. Like, did we just have to sit in traffic? Were our kids yelling in the backseat of the car? Are we in a tiff with our spouse? Are we, blah, blah, blah. Even if we just spent, an hour processing email before that, the seat of willpower in the brain is the anterior cingulate cortex. And that lies about 2 inches behind, your third eye of your forehead, right behind your prefrontal cortex. And it's a hub of all kinds of things, not only resisting temptation, aka willpower, but also making decisions, regulating emotional responses, regulating task performance, and all sorts of other things. And it's a part of the brain that gets especially fatigued through just 15 minutes of hard labor. Yeah. And so if your willpower is blown out, it's just not going to show up for you in a clutch situation. I call that falling into the willpower gap. Like, better. And yet there you are ordering a pizza. Like, what just happened? Right. And so, it's not that you weren't resolved enough on January 1st, and it's not that you don't know that pizza is not on your food plan. It's that it actually, you show people flashcards and they ace it. Like, they know to be eating blueberries for breakfast and salad. Like, they know. Yeah. But we fall into the willpower gap. Right. And so what I teach in my program of Bright Line Eating is a system of building up automaticity with food so that we get our eating closer and closer to essentially like brushing our teeth, right? It's just an action sequence that gets launched at a certain time of day under certain conditions, and we just do it kind of by rote. I literally have people write down their food the night before, what they're going to eat, according to a food plan that's designed to maximize automaticity. Like imagine, for example, if your dentist told you that you now, Jerry, need to brush and floss 6 times a day.
Oh, gosh.
Right? 3 months later, 6 months later, you go back to the dentist. How successful would you report that you've been, Jerry? How was your brushing and flossing 6 times a day, right? Like no way, right?
Yeah,
no
it's
way.
not going to happen. Yeah.
Not going to happen. Twice a day, you're probably managing, right? Like with phenomenal fidelity and success and consistency, not because you're motivated, not because you have a sticky note on your window, like on your bathroom mirror reminding you, but because literally it's just what you do, right? And that's a different part of the brain. It's the basal ganglia. It just launches these behavior sequences, right? You pull out of the driveway, you drive the car onto the highway, like you just know how to do these action sequences, right? In that certain circumstance, you launch the needed behavior. Well, that's what breakfast, lunch, and dinner can be like, but not a bunch of snacks in between. This is another reason why meals and not snacking is so important, because you can automate breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So anyway, at a party, how are you going to navigate that? Well, this is where I really recommend writing down your food the night before. So you're thinking ahead, okay, I've got a party tomorrow. And then you're thinking, well, the party starts at 7. Why don't I just eat before I go? Like, I don't even need to face that buffet line. Or maybe it's a whole event and you're going to eat there. Well, then you actually need to make the painful phone call and find out what they're serving. And, and if it's actually a buffet, you might consider bringing your digital food scale. You might not, you might eyeball your portions, but you're going to need to take some actions to make sure that you get through that meal. And this is where, our society just has this kind of fly by the seat of our pants relationship with food that's gone really to almost a ludicrous extreme, where almost everyone's waking up in the morning having no idea what they're going to eat that day. And they walk out of the house thinking that they're going to be successful because they've got some kind of quote unquote resolve. And it's like, good luck with that, buddy. Well,
and that's where you get into the, like, I woke up and I looked around. I didn't see what I wanted right now. It's not that I went to the grocery store buying these things to eat them at these meals, right? But I didn't see what I wanted right now, so I'll hit the drive-through on the way to work.
Right, exactly.
Or I know that so-and-so is going to bring donuts or breakfast tacos or whatever it is to the office. And so, or I'll be the person that shows up late because I'm bringing food, right?
Totally. And that idea of being a responder to a brain that's suggesting what it wants to eat right now is a real pitfall, right? This is another piece of beauty of writing down what you're going to eat the night before, because you're really separating the decision process from the momentary impulse. The momentary impulse is subject to, like, how many hours of sleep did you get the night before? You know? Because if you didn't get, the full 8 hours, you're now going to have a brain that's going to be demanding more calorically dense, more sugar flour laden foods. But, if you're writing down your food the night before, you're free from those influences. You're not deciding what you're going to eat in the moment. You're planning what you're going to eat tomorrow. The brain completely makes a distinction there. Like, you're not trying to satisfy some momentary urge. I have a lot of people who join Bright Line Eating who say, it's like torture writing down my food the night before. I stand there looking at my food journal. I don't know what to write. I can't decide. Do I really have to do that? Like, I know what the food plan is. Why can't I decide in the moment which vegetable I want to eat? And I say, no, because literally you're caving to this notion that it's important that you eat what you feel like eating in the moment. And it's actually breaking free from that. That's really, really critical. That's where the freedom lies.
Right. Well, and so you mentioned the basal ganglia. And so is that the same type of situation? Because, like, I think everybody's been in this where they're driving home from work or from, a kid's ball game or whatever, and they get in the driveway and they go, how did I get here? Like, like they forget
Oh
all
yeah,
the different terms, right?
Yeah,
They just automatically, it's
totally.
like, oh,
I drive
how did I
home.
get here?
Yeah.
Right.
It's
Like,
right. That kind of autopilot. And
yeah.
That autopilot is it's a savior and it's a menace, right? It depends on how we're looking at it. In certain areas, it's a savior. Like in Bright Line Eating, we harness that automaticity to bridge the willpower gap. It's like the most critical thing is we develop. I mean, I execute eating like the most amazing, delicious, abundant, fabulous breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day with no more effort than I put on my clothes. Like or take my shower. And, we all have our routine in the shower. We shampoo in a certain way, we wash in a certain order, whatever. Right. That's how I'm making my breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It's like done and dusted. So easy. On the other hand, that kind of automaticity around, for example, a gratitude practice is a death knell, because now you're trying to practice gratitude and it's rote, or prayer, right? Like, God, thank you for my day. Thank you for, please help so-and-so, please help so-and-so. Like, well, what good is that? Right. Like, so when you have automaticity with other things, it's like worthless. Right. Yeah. So you have to actually deliberately inject some variety, some spontaneity, some presence of mind into something to fight against that kind of automaticity. But the brain's an amazing thing. And it'll, if you keep doing stuff over and over again, it'll just start to automate it for you. And that can be a total gift. I mean, it's a time saver is what it is. Yeah, it is if you do it right. And one of the things, and it sounds really familiar to one of the things that I tell a lot of my clients is like, I'm trying to teach you to make a manual decision on if you want this or that. Like, because honestly, I tell them like one meal is not going to kill you unless you choke on it. Like one meal is not going to be you can't get up from the table, you're dead. It's the combination of several meals together to get you to that point of your chronic disease is too much and you have a heart attack or whatever. But like, make the manual decision to, do I want to feel the way this is going to make me feel? Do I want to deal with the issues that this is going to bring up? Do I want to, and not just like, maybe it's 30 minutes later because this is going to cause me to run to the bathroom, or the next morning because I'm going to wake up going, oh, I had that again and I don't want that. Why did I do that? Because in the moment, like you said earlier, the dopamine hit is tempting. Yeah. But it's the after effect of like, and so I would tell them like, hey, if you make the manual decision versus being on autopilot and like manually, okay, you know what? I know this is going to make me feel like crap. I know this is going to make me deal with all kinds of triggers or whatever, but I'm going to eat it. I say, okay, go ahead. Like as long as you know what's coming. It's the when we don't know what's coming that it's like, ugh. Yeah. Okay. So can I speak from the addict? Sure. Go ahead. So, when addiction is in play, kind of one of the ways of looking at addiction is it's the universe in which tiny actions have ridiculously outsized consequences, right? The person who has the drug problem, right, who's been clean and sober for several months and decides to have one beer, goes into manual mode and says, I really just want one beer with the fellas after work, right? Now one beer turns to another, to a highball, and now someone's got, a little packet of cocaine in their pocket, and now they're going out and to the back alley and they're snorting a few rails, and now, they don't come home for a couple of days. Right. Which leads to the wife who was already on the fence deciding to file for divorce. Right. I lived that life as a teenager. I went through cycles where a beer in March and suddenly I was in jail in August, and I didn't know, I wasn't able to trace it back and say, well, I was really doing fine until I picked up that beer in March, which led to, so that's the challenge is, 1/3 of the population is not susceptible to addiction at all. And I mean, not susceptible. Like you could inject them with heroin every day and they wouldn't get addicted to it. They're not susceptible to addiction. And they develop tolerance and withdrawal because that's what the body does when it gets. But just think of all the people who are going home with massive opiate prescriptions after back surgery. Yeah. They take those pills, and then when it's time to wean off, they wean off. It's not a problem. They don't get addicted. 1/3 of the population is moderately susceptible to addiction, and 1/3 of the population is profoundly highly susceptible to addiction. And everyone listening probably has a sense of where they are. They can look in their family tree because it's genetic and say, okay, how many heavy drinkers, heavy smokers, and super overweight people do we have? Yeah. You can also look at your personality because it is a personality thing as well, that sort of impulsive, overly sensitive personality profile, right? So I, on the one hand, I encourage people to run their experiments and make their decisions. And I have a saying, which is, I never deny anyone their research. Like, go, you want to go eat a donut, go eat a donut. I do think it's important to recognize that for some people, total abstinence is going to be the best approach. Right. Not from all food, obviously, that's ridiculous. Sure. But you can, you don't have to eat donuts to live. You don't have to eat pizza to live, right? Right. Yeah. You can abstain from them entirely. Yeah. And so the manual mode of so here's the other thing, Jerry, around think about how it's going to make you feel. Here's one of the hallmarks of the addicted mind is actually the inability to call to mind with sufficient force the consequences of your behavior in the moment when the brain is tugging at you, right? And this is how the parent who does love their spouse and children will pick up and use, knowing that Child Protective Services is coming and it's, you know what I mean? And, and in that moment, they can't weigh it out. Like their brain somehow insanely dwarfs the consequences, spins some stupid excuse, or just forgets to think about it altogether. It can take any number of forms. But, deciding to sort of think it through can be actually really problematic. And so sometimes this is where the term bright line eating comes from. A bright line is just a clear boundary that you never cross. Just decide you're never going to cross that boundary to get the results that you want. And so that saves you from having to think it through. Yeah. In the moment you might not think so clearly, right? That's true, yeah. Because, it'll look so good and you're just going to want to eat it. But you just stick to the bright lines. That's the rule. So, yeah. Well,
and that defines, like, a lot of people think that, because I'm an athlete and I run a lot of masters races across the country, and so I'm very particular about not just what I eat from a health standpoint because of what I do, but just also because, like, I want to perform at my best. And I'm not willing to go into, like, the other side of things of like, oh, well, there's other things that you can put in your body. They're going to make you perform better. No, like, I want to do it naturally. I'm plant-based. Like, I am like, this is how I'm going to do it. And a lot of people look at me like, oh, I could never have your discipline. Right. And to me, it's not discipline. To me, it's just, I know what I want to get out of my performance. And so if I don't give it, like, it's like putting the wrong kind of fuel in a car. Like, I know it's not going to perform well. Yeah. And so why would I do that? And so I am the person that goes to a lot of buffets or luncheons, and like, I'll eat before I go, and I show up and I sit there with an empty plate and drink some water, and it looks a little weird, but now that I've done it for 5 or 6 years, people are like, okay, that's just Jerry. He's, you know, and they sit next to me and they're like, don't judge me for what I'm eating. I'm like, I'm not going to judge you. Eat whatever you want. I don't care.
But I say too. I say, as long as you don't pin me down and force it down my throat, we're cool. Right. Like, I don't care what you eat. Right. I don't care what you drink. I don't care what you eat. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting because people also say that to me, you have so much discipline, and I don't think of it as discipline either. What do I think of it? I mean, I'm actually a ridiculously undisciplined person by nature. And so I have gradually built up a series of habits that serve me because I'm a mess without them. And kind of like you want your results with running, I want my results with life. Like, I just want the life that I live, that I have today. And I've run the experiment every which way, and I like living this way better. And it's interesting. Scientists did a study looking at willpower, and they found that the most successful people used the least willpower. The most disciplined people used the least willpower. And that's because they had all kinds of habits that they built up to support them. So they weren't relying on willpower. They were relying on their rituals, their routines, their habits, their regimens. And they were rarely tapping into willpower. They were just kind of living their whole morning, a lot of their midday, and then their whole evening the same way most people run that, 10-minute stretch of time when they turn and brush their teeth, right? Like it's just kind of a habit stack of like, well, I do this thing and then I do that thing. And that's kind of how I live. And I didn't get it for free. I built it up over time, and I didn't do it because I'm disciplined. I really did it because I'm undisciplined. There was a stretch of time in my 20s when I was getting my Ph.D. when my coursework was over and I didn't have to go into class anymore. Yeah. I literally had a hard time getting out of bed before 2 p.m. I would sleep almost all day. The dishes would pile up. The laundry would pile up. I was clinically depressed on huge doses of antidepressants. I was eating at least a pint of ice cream every night. I remember how hard it was to get up by 2 because I had a group therapy appointment for graduate student women at 2 p.m. on Tuesdays. And I slept through it a few times. Like I didn't get out of bed in time to get there. Yeah. It was at 2. I couldn't get up in time. Right. So I'm not too disciplined. I am not too disciplined. Yeah. It's a funny thing, discipline, right? Yeah.
Oh yeah, it is. Well, and I think it all comes down to not so much discipline, but like having something that you want to get out of life. Yeah. And then like, putting those steps and habits in place to like, okay, well, if I do these things, I know that I'm going to get this. And it's the same thing with food. Like if I eat these things, I know I'm going to accomplish this with my body, or, it's going to lead to weight loss. If I need to lose weight, it's going to lead to whatever it is, better brain function, all those things. Because, like you said, if you hold up flashcards, people know what to eat. Like the information is out there. It's not like it's hidden somewhere in some secret book. It's easy to attain the information of like, what should I be eating to have?
Broccoli is really good for you.
Exactly. Right.
Leafy greens, shocker.
Yeah. And like, you have to go through research to find out that a walnut helps your brain because it looks like a brain. Like there's certain things that are just like, they look like they're they're supposed to help. And so it's like, it's more about having that decision to this is what I want to do. And is that a piece of the addiction piece is like, I can't get to the point of making that decision of what I want to do because I'm so ingrained in, I need this.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. What I found in my addiction is I was well beyond any point where what I wanted would translate into any behavior. And this is where someone really needs support and a recovery program, because you can't just will your way into, a more functional life at that point. Right. And this is where, bright line eating or a 12-step food program or something is going to really, really be helpful. Yeah. I really needed a community of people who were living differently, who would teach me how to live, and help me to set up those structures. And really, I fell in line. I think it's the kind of the herd instinct that we have as human beings. I surrounded myself with people who are living differently. And I got someone one-on-one to support me. And I started being able to do it differently, but it was not something that I could just, do because I wanted it. I wanted it for years. I was struggling so hard to live differently. And I just couldn't. And that's the thing about addiction. It really irks me when people say everyone's addicted to something, and I'm like, no, not everyone's addicted to something. Like everyone's got bad habits. I'll give you that. Right. But, addiction is when you're using beyond your will, against your will. You don't want to be, and you might even have tears streaming down your face when you're doing it. Right. And you're saying to yourself, why am I doing this again? I don't want to be doing this. Yeah. I know this is hurting me. I don't want this anymore. Right. And it's just a state of true powerlessness. And, there is help, but it's got to come from community and, often a higher power, that sort of thing. Release from addiction is a phenomenon of grace, ultimately. Right.
And so, but mentioning like being stuck in the moment and like, I know I shouldn't be doing this and I'm doing this. Like a lot of people would say, oh, but I just binge, right? I'm not addicted to it. I just binge. And so are those two separate things or are they intertwined?
They're related. They are separate. So binge eating disorder is different than food addiction. They are correlated, though. And yeah, I mean, I had both. I was diagnosed with binge eating disorder when I was 22 or 23. My best friend reminds me that I binged so hard this one time that I ruptured my stomach lining. I don't remember that.
Oh my gosh.
I know. I have a little mental block. She's like, oh, no, you ruptured your stomach lining and had to get flown to California to see an eating disorder specialist. I remember that. I remember being in California, seeing the eating disorder specialist. And she diagnosed with me with binge eating disorder, and of course gave me a prescription for some freaking, pill or whatever, which may have helped a little. I don't remember. But so binging technically is eating in one sitting a quantity of food way bigger than a normal eater would eat, way faster, and with a feeling of being out of control. And I think that most people with binge eating disorder would have food addiction as well. I think the linchpin is, if you eliminate sugar and flour from the diet, do you get some relief? Like, is it, does abstinence help? And binging can be really hard to overcome. It's a really, really fierce foe, binging. Yeah. It's hard. Bright line eating does help a lot of people with their binging. And weirdly, there's also this thing where abstinence can sometimes create almost like a rubber band effect. Like the rubber band is stretching and stretching and stretching, and suddenly, it snaps and then you binge, where it can actually set you up for a binge too. And caloric restriction can do that as well. So the thing about food addiction is it's the only addiction that creates a side effect. Through engaging in the addiction, you create this ancillary, kind of unrelated side effect of excess weight. Right. But then when you stop the addiction and you want to address this side effect, treating the side effect actually sends you back to the original addiction or kicks up urges. Oh, really? It's like, imagine that drinking alcohol caused horribly disfiguring acne. Right. And as you develop alcoholism, you start to get more and more of this acne. But as soon as you get sober, you still have all this acne. And then you go to the doctor to get a treatment for the acne. And he gives you the treatment for the acne, but also says the challenge is, the side effect is it causes cravings for alcohol. Right. Like, well, that's messed up. That's not good. oh no, right? Yeah. So losing weight actually, creates changes in the brain that drive us back to food addiction, because the brain fights against weight loss tooth and nail. Oh yeah. The brain doesn't realize that we're overweight and we would be healthier if we lost some weight. The brain fights to maintain its weight, and any weight loss is seen as a famine and a dire emergency. So, so it can be very hard. It's doable. I did it and lots of people do it, but it can be very hard to address food addiction and weight loss at the same time. So sometimes it's better for a while to stabilize at a maintenance food plan, not lose any weight, but just start eating no sugar, no flour, 3 meals a day, weigh and measure your food, eat ample quantities so that you're stable with your weight, and give that a few months, especially if your binge eating disorder has been really wicked. And then gradually cut back the quantities to start to get the weight off.
So is that why, I know a lot of people, obviously, I mean, everybody knows people that most of us have done it and seen it, is, I'm way too much. Let me go on a diet. I'll lose a little weight, but then, it comes back after 6 months or a year or however long. And it's like, I bounced back. Is that because maybe there was a food addiction and we didn't address it? And so as soon as we hit, now I feel like I'm at a right weight, right? Or we defined ourselves as, I want to lose this much weight. And we get to that point and then we relax and have that binge moment. And then the food addiction kicks up and boom, there we go.
So weight regain happens for so many reasons, and you just named some of them. So sort of woven into the scenario that you just presented, one of them was a diet mentality, right? Like that we started to lose weight and we were mentally imagining ourselves being vigilant for a while until we get the weight off, which is really just diet mentality, because the way to do it is, when you get the weight off, you don't actually change anything. You might eat a little bit more food, a tiny bit more more food so that you're not losing weight anymore. You're now maintaining, but
Right.
all the rigors that you had when you were losing weight, you got to keep them up when you're
Right.
at maintenance, or you're just going to regain the weight. So that's one thing, is diet mentality. Another thing is, I think you're right. I think it's highly likely that someone who's dieting and doesn't know about food addiction probably, odds are, was in the 2/3 of the population who had at least some food addiction on board. And so if they never addressed that, that's going to creep up on them and drive their weight up. But then there's also kind of what I was talking about before, which is the brain doesn't like weight loss, and the brain is going to defend that higher weight set point. Now, there's three things that research shows will trick the brain, allow the brain, relax the brain to let it allow you to lose your excess weight and keep it off. One of them is enough protein. The other is simple foods, like really simple, not a lot of recipes and concoctions and fancy, sexy foods. Right. Simple foods, like someone looks at your plate, they can identify it. Oh, there's the steamed spinach. There's the tofu. There's the brown rice. I see that plate of food. It's simple, right? And then the third one is exercise. Those are the three things that allow the brain to lower the adiposity set point. Now, you're going to think this is ridiculous, but despite that, I actually recommend that at first, when people start bright line eating, they don't exercise, or at least they don't start an exercise regimen if they haven't got one established. And that's because changing your food as drastically as we have people change it is kind of enough for the willpower muscle, right? Like we just need you focused on getting your food straight, and give that enough time to become automatic, then by all means exercise. But weight regain is problematic even in bright line eating. It happens less in bright line eating. I really think our data show that we're the most successful weight loss program on planet Earth, and we have published data in the Journal of Nutrition and Weight Loss and other peer-reviewed outlets that I think show that. But still, some people are going to regain their weight. And, a lot of it is, it's just really, 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 really hard to live in this food culture and do it a different way. And, if you're not mentally ready to adopt a new identity and really do something countercultural and swim upstream with the way you handle your food, if you just have a part of you that's resentful about that and rebels against that, then there's no amount of a great system that's going to address that. You really have to want it. This isn't something for people who need it. Unfortunately, it's for people who want it.
Right. Well, and I do the same thing with my people that come to me that say they want to change their nutrition. Is one, I tell them, well, I can teach you how to eat properly and just like give you a meal plan and you can go away and everything, but you're not going to be successful because there's so much more behind it, right? But the other thing is, I said, which do you want to address first? Do you want to start exercising or do you want to do nutrition? Because to change both it's sort of like that January 1st resolution that we know doesn't work to pass January 21st. It's like, it's not going to happen because it's so much change at once. But what I found is that like when somebody starts eating a much more nutrient dense meal plan, that the body like starts craving exercise. It starts craving movement. It's like, you're giving me the right stuff. I want to move now. I want to do things. Like,
do you know why that happens?
Tell me
the physiology of that. Yeah.
Because I understand that it happens because I've seen it happen, but I'm like, I can just tell people this is going to happen, but back me up.
Yeah. It's all about leptin. Okay. So leptin is such a critical hormone when it comes to food and weight and exercise. Leptin is actually the hormone that's responsible for all of the mammals out there who are in a right-sized body. Like there's no fat mammals out there. Like look around, cats, dogs, and unless you're feeding them, in your house. But, deer, like you never see a fat deer, right? Like they don't exist. And the only fat squirrels are in the amusement park eating our food.
Right.
So leptin is the feedback mechanism that keeps body weight in check. Leptin is released by fat cells when they get plumper and fatter. And plumper, fatter fat cells release more leptin. Leptin circles back to the brain and it says two things. It says, you've had enough food. You can stop eating now and go get active. Go use that fuel to, find a mate, build a hut, kill a wildebeest, right? Like go do some productive things with all that fuel. So when people would eat, back in the day, let's say the hunt had been successful, the berries are all full and ripe, people would sit around and gorge themselves for a few days. They would put on some fat, right, and it would circle back to the brain. The leptin would say, go get active. Okay. So why are we all so fat now? Well, it's not that we don't have leptin anymore. Actually, when leptin was discovered in 1994 and coined, the word leptin comes from the Greek leptos for thin. It's the hormone that makes you thin.
Right.
And of course, the pharmaceutical companies spent millions trying to put it into pills and shots and nasal sprays. And it doesn't work because we have plenty of leptin. The fatter we are, the more leptin we have because it's being released. We are big fat cells.
Right.
But what's happening is it's blocked in the brain. The brain's not seeing it. So that's called leptin resistance.
Okay.
Leptin resistance is caused by several things. It's caused by unhealthy blood, essentially. It's caused by insulin levels that are too high at baseline. It's caused by inflammation, which actually inflames the part of the brain that regulates eating and satiety. The ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus is actually inflamed. And so that causes it. And triglycerides, high triglycerides cause leptin resistance as well. So leptin's blocked at the brain. The brain doesn't see the leptin. So as soon as we start eating what you're calling a nutrient dense diet, right, and probably involves not eating a lot of sugar and flour, because those are like about as not nutrient dense as it gets, right?
Yep.
So you stop eating sugar and flour, you start eating a lot of vegetables and
whole foods.
Whole foods. So what happens? Your triglycerides come down really fast. Your insulin starts to regulate better. You don't need to, your baseline insulin comes down. Your inflammation comes down. Suddenly your brain can see the leptin. And like one half of that signal is you can stop eating. Now you're full. Another half of that signal is it's time to get active. You feel like moving. So that's the signal of, you feel like moving. You feel like getting active. Yeah.
That's cool. But that's another thing that I tell people is like eat like we all think like hunter gatherer, like, and there's a lot of like people saying, oh, eat like the hunter gatherer and do all the. It's like, okay, but the hunter gatherer didn't have the refrigerator that's like 10 feet away in the pantry that's stocked because you go to the grocery store once or twice a week. That can then just walk over there and go, okay, well, I have an urge for this because it's got sugar or flour. It's going to hit my taste buds. It's going to light everything up. And so for that person that's stuck in that circle, like what's the first, like, is the first step identifying like I have a problem like it is with so many other addictions?
I think so. I really think so. And there's an easy quiz you can take online. If you're just curious, like how susceptible is my brain to food addiction, right? Like there's a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is low. I'm guessing you're pretty low is my guess, Jerry. I think you're in the like 1, 2, 3 range, right? And I'm a 10. I'm a 10. Call it 10 plus. God bless me. There's like 5 questions on this quiz. It takes like 30 seconds to answer. So you can go to foodaddictionquiz.com, foodaddictionquiz.com, take the quiz, see where you're at from 1 to 10. And then the question is like, do you have a weight problem too? Because if you've got a struggle with your weight and you're like 7 or above on this scale, now that's a 1-2 punch where it's like, you're going to have to take that really seriously. Like that's not the kind of situation where, a good New Year's resolution and a solid food plan and you're set. Like, no, buddy, you got your work ahead of you.
Right.
And if you've got, no weight problem or a minor weight thing and you're like a 5 or a 2, well, now that's additional information. Like I don't begrudge anyone their food. I mean, oh my gosh, if I could eat, chocolate and have a decent life, I'd be doing it,
Right.
So if you're a 2 on the susceptibility scale, that's good information. Then you really are in the situation where, a bite of chocolate cake after a meal with friends might hit the spot, It might scratch the itch and make you feel good and it might be worth it. Right. For me, a bite of chocolate cake doesn't scratch any itch. It makes it itchier.
Right.
It's not worth it for me. Yeah. It's just going to light the flame. So, I think the first step is to find out what you're dealing with and keep in mind that the food and the weight issue are separate. It's not the case that everyone who's got clinical class 3 obesity is going to be super high on the food addiction susceptibility scale. That's not actually how it pans out. They correlate, but not as strongly as you might think. So you need to find out separately, what's my food addiction score? And then what's my weight problem? And they're both hard issues. So if you both of them, then you really got to pay attention. Yeah.
Well, and I would assume like in today's society, because there's so many, I mean, the obesity and overweight issue is just getting worse, that like, I would assume most people that are probably over 30, 35, 40 and have a food addiction are probably going to lean towards a weight issue as well. Right.
Yes. But 22% of people at a normal BMI test out as high on the susceptibility scale. Yep. They've got a strong metabolism, and they might be, their life might be like this, Jerry. They might be like running 10 miles, obsessing about that, non-fat frozen yogurt. Then they're going to allow themselves, go get the non-fat frozen yogurt and then think, I better run 3 more miles, just to be safe. Right. So some people are crazy in the head, and they are rocking the slim physique. Like, it's not showing up on the body. So interestingly, the 2 BMI categories, I did a study on this, and I sampled thousands of Americans, and I got literally a representative sample of people in the United States from every demographic, a pure representative sample. It costs a lot of money to get that, because it's hard to do.
It's hard to do. Yeah.
And what the study showed was that the 2 BMI categories that are most likely to be high, like really high on the food addiction susceptibility scale, are, not surprisingly, very obese, but then underweight.
Okay.
Actually, even more than obese, underweight. So, we need to reframe our thinking a little bit about food addiction and what it looks like, because it can look all different ways on the body.
Right. Well, and like you mentioned, I mean, even in your story, is like, I think a lot of times it's like, okay, well, I realize I'm an addictive personality. That doesn't just mean you stick to one addiction. Right. You may have multiple at once. You may go from one to another and back and forth. And like, it's not just, I only have one thing I have to deal with.
Totally. Oh, that itch in the brain, it wants to be scratched. It doesn't really care where it gets it gets it from, Yeah. But you got to wire it up in a specific domain. Like to this day, so far, I haven't ever been addicted to shopping. I just don't care much about shopping. Right. And I have felt the beginnings of a development of a gambling addiction, but never really developed it. And I'm safe. I could go into a casino and bet a little and be fine. But because of my brain wiring, I'm vulnerable to developing any addiction, given a hard time in my life and a bunch of experiences with certain cue reward experiences. I could wire up any addiction. So, totally.
Well, I want to be cognizant of time, and because I mean, it feels like we've been talking for 10 minutes, and it's like, this has been great. You've been so helpful. Tons of information. How can people, like, brightlineeating.com, correct?
That's right. So it's BRIGHT. Yep. BRIGHTLINE, brightlineeating.com. And they can also take the quiz, and that'll put them on my email list. They can unsubscribe at any time, just click the unsubscribe button at the bottom. But foodaddictionquiz.com. That'll work too. And I put out a weekly vlog for fun and for free every week, talking about some of these issues. And you can find those at brightlineeating.com too. You just click on vlog, and you can search literally by any topic. Like we were talking about cross addiction, right? You could just type in cross addiction. I got a vlog on that, nice. Anything you want.
That's awesome. So,
that's where they can find me.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Susan, for your time.
Thanks, Jerry. It's been great to talk with you. Take care.